Good day, good afternoon, or good evening to teachers, students, and the generally curious to the 13th and final episode of our fall edition of the Constitution of American Life with the Friends of Publius. Just a reminder as we prepare to leave you for a month or so of who we are so that you don't forget. We have Professor Tim Moore, who taught in high school for over 30 years and then abandoned the classroom to become a man in the ivory tower at the University of Wisconsin, where he is working with the famous Dr. John Kaminsky at the Center for the Study of the Constitution. We also have Professor Chris Kavanaugh, who taught for 30 years in close to Indianapolis. I forget the community. I'm sorry, Mr. Kavanaugh. In Plainfield. He taught in Plainfield for 30 years and then decided to relocate to the beautiful state of North Dakota, where he is currently expanding the minds of the young. He has also taught at the university level and is considered one of the finest civic educators in the United States of America. And then we have, of course, the young rock and roll star of the group, and that is Dr. James Michael Williams. We call him Pipsqueak, but anyway, he is professor of political science, international relations, specialty on South Africa at the University of San Diego, and it is paradise for all of you east of the Mississippi. If I were to move anywhere in California, I'd move to San Diego. His only fault is that he's a Giants fan, but we still love him nevertheless. There is much going on in the world today, so much that I understand that it can be overwhelming and it provides incentive to bury your head in reruns of Gilligan's Islands or the Twitterverse, as Professor Kavanaugh does. We have the wonderful excitement of the World Cup with plenty of upsets and inspiring expressions of individual talent. America, as it has for many years, continues to show the world how to shoot guns and shoot them effectively. And I don't mean to make light, but I do mean to make light because it's just starting to reach a level of I don't know what with the gun-related shootings in this country. And finally, the country is waiting in excited anticipation for the next session of Congress as future historical greats like Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan, and Marjorie Taylor Greene prepare to present a legislative agenda matching only that of the progressives and the New Dealers. Think about it. In today's episode, we're going to be dealing with a topic that touches upon the historical, philosophical, and ethical dimensions of American constitutional life, and that is secrecy in government. As we all know, America's Constitution was birthed in relative secrecy as the delegates to Philadelphia approved a secrecy rule in May of 1787. This would begin a 240-year debate over what role, if any, should secrecy play in a democratic republic. So in the next hour or so, we hope to touch upon the decision to hold the Constitutional Convention in secret, look at the rules of the convention, and evaluate the role of secret deliberations in deliberative and administrative agencies. So let's begin our discussion with our own personal friend of Publius rock star, Dr. Mike Williams. Mike, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the question, I would like to begin with a conceptual discussion. I'm hoping this involves all of us here. Can secrecy in government go hand in hand with democratic principles and the right of the people's right to know?
Yeah, I think the short answer is I think it can. I think the key word there is there needs to be a balance between the citizens' right to information, the right to know what's happening in their government. That needs to be balanced with allowing elected and in some cases unelected policymakers the ability to have candid conversations, have conversations with information that, as we can talk about later, may need to be kept secret because it may contain information that could be harmful to some if the information got out. But I think the key there is balance. And unlike some of our discussions that are grounded in constitutional text, this idea, I think, has definitely evolved over time. And I'll look to Tim and Chris to either tell me I'm on the right track. But if we were originalists on this question, I think there's an argument that there would be very little balance, because I think the framers and even a lot of the state legislatures, from my learning on this over the week, took secrecy to be a very important principle. I mean, I read there were state legislatures where the state law was, it was illegal to publish the laws of the state without permission from the state government. So if you're an originalist on this, I think you're going to have to tilt towards maybe more secrecy than we're comfortable with today. So there needs to be a balance. And along with that balance, I guess I'd finish up by saying, there needs to be trust, right? I mean, citizens need the trust that the government, in making certain decisions, may need to withhold information, and that what they're withholding, they have good reason to do so. I think in current times, where there is maybe the lowest levels of trust ever in our republic, and also at a time where things appear to be more and more secretive, I think that balance has been harder to get in practice. But I don't see anything like in terms of democratic theory that says you have to have completely open government in order for there to be a democracy. And I'll stop there.
Chris, Tim?
I'm going to push back a little bit, because if you're going back to an originalist position, I'll just go with a few words here. Congress shall make no law. And that's pretty clear. And so the idea of bridging the freedom of the press, I know I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here. So, and Mike used a great word, and I would agree about balance, constantly weighing the public's right to know, not a need to know, right to know, versus the ability of folks running our government to be able to run it in a way that is not only efficient, but effective. So I think balance, but you talk about originalism. Congress is not supposed to get in the way of a freedom of the press, and we all know that the press is perhaps the fourth branch of government, if not the fifth branch. We can go back to administrative state, so it is about balance, and we do have a right to know, not necessarily need to know. We have a right to know as a public.
Professor Moore?
No, I would just be repeating. I'd probably side with Mike on this one, largely because throughout democratic or representative systems throughout history, they've always wrestled with it, and they've come to a similar conclusion that there's got to be a balance. So I mean, I would side with Mike on this one.
So I guess the legal technical question in this realm of balance is, where is the line drawn? How do we draw those lines, both in deliberative bodies and administrative bodies? And I'm hoping maybe we can touch on that. I am wondering, Professor Kavanaugh, why the delegates themselves? Was it just, again, kind of building a little bit upon what Mike said? Is it the delegates decided on the secrecy rule very early on in the proceedings, just because it was tradition? Is that why they did it? And what did they think would happen if they didn't? That's what I'm curious. What did they think would happen if they didn't have a secrecy rule?
Well, I think that the secrecy rules established by at the convention in Philadelphia, there was nothing out of the ordinary about that at that time frame. As Mike alluded to, you had state legislatures that were already operating partially in the dark or in secret. You go back to Parliament, and Parliament doing things in secret. As a matter of fact, they were worried about the king perhaps sending his spies in to reveal what was talking about. So the idea of a legislative body or a group of men lawmakers. And granted, they were working on at the convention, so they weren't really lawmakers, but there were a strong legislative history of secrecy in that. So that wasn't, at the time, it wasn't that big of an issue. It really becomes more of an issue after the convention is done. That's where you start to see, people throwing stones and you see the anti-federalists, whether it be Sentinel or others. And I know Tim can speak to that, but you see people more so after the fact. And I think most of the members at Philadelphia were good with the press blackout, if you will, in terms of, because they want to be able to promote that free and open debate. They don't want misrepresentations working their way out into local press, because once the local, as you know, it was no different than today. Once the local press gets a whiff of something, they're going to run with it, and they're worried about misrepresentations in the local media. So I think they hope to promote, one, that free and open debate that's going to be needed, and two, they try and prevent that misrepresentation in the public. So by the time they get done with the product, whatever that product may be in Philadelphia, people don't have this preconceived notion. They don't have these already biases built up toward it. This is why I think you see more of the complaints coming afterward from the anti-federalists about the secrecy rule as opposed to during it.
Well, is it my understanding that one, and I guess we're going to get kind of into the legal part here, did the New York delegates who left violate that rule? And two, what was their alleged enforcement mechanism if you did violate the rule?
Well, that's the thing, is like they didn't have an official enforcement. It was the idea of, this is what you should be doing. And we know that people wrote letters. We know that people leaked a little bit out. And Lansing and was it Yates? Lansing and Yates were the New York delegates that left. And they were not the only ones, but they felt once they had left, that secrecy provision no longer applied to them. I think part of it too is I don't think they wanted to face the wrath of General Washington, because he was such an intimidating guy. I know there's a story of the convention about somebody finding a copy of the Virginia plan out in the foyer, so to speak, and somebody found it and brought it in and gave it to Washington, and Washington's like, hey, we had an agreement that this stuff was not supposed to leave. And the description is, you can see these guys all going, oh, crap, where's my copy of the Virginia plan, right? Where's my copy? It's not mine. Then this other guy who couldn't find his went up to check the handwriting. Oh, not my handwriting. And he found his back in his room, right, in Philadelphia. So part of it, and by the way, as the story goes, no one actually ever claimed that. And they never claimed that. And by the way, Washington had left and gave them a chance to even come up and get it without him being there. So I think part of it is the wrath of Washington, right? So it's like,
that obviously didn't work for the New York delegates who left, right?
Well, but again, those guys left so early on, they could only really write about the few days that they were there. So even if they did share that information, it was a very limited view of what was going on. I think
Professor Moore, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Chris is dead on this. It was the second day. The first day, I think there was 8 or 10 rules that they agreed on, and then on the second day, they kind of elaborate a little bit on what was hinted at a secrecy proposal the first day. So the second day, and there was 4 or 5 more that they added. But it was the first and I think it was the first and the second day of the convention they settled on the rules. I would also suggest it's not out of the ordinary at all, because I mean, all these guys at Philadelphia have been in their state legislatures. They've been in Continental Congress, the Articles Congress. They're used to, and some of them were involved in writing their state constitutions during the Revolution. Those were all written in secrecy at the state level. So they're used to, as legislators, and as members of conventions that wrote constitutions in the 70s, they're used to it. I mean, there's a lot of great comments that when we look at it, I think it was, let me check here. Nathan Dane says, like, no, the people are only privy to what the end product is. And others actually kind of make the today we talk about, no one wants to see bologna made because they never, no one would ever eat it. And there's a lot of comments like that from some of these delegates that say, look, if people saw us wrangling through this summer, it would be totally disillusioning. So there's a lot of contemporaries. Now, they're the ones that are voting secrecy. And I think a suspicious mind would say, well, they're kind of, it's the CYA, but they're all experienced with it as legislators. It's common practice. Parliament, colonial legislatures did it. The Articles Congress. So it's just part and parcel to how things are done.
So I want to be. Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry. I'm sorry, David. I just want to make sure I got this right too, because I know that Madison, after later in life, he got a lot of pressure to release his notes because people wanted to know. And he said, if you want to understand the Constitution, go to the debates in the state ratifying convention, right? If you want to understand, what's going on with the Constitution, kind of backing up what you said, this is the finished product. Now let's debate the finished product. So, and he was reluctant to share his notes.
Sure.
I think he shared them with some close
confidence. Yeah, I actually pulled this quote up, and we'll put this in the resource. There's a great pamphlet that was written by my boss a couple of years ago on this very topic. But Madison says, it was best for the convention for forming the Constitution to sit behind closed doors. Opinions are varied at first, so crude, unrefined, and needed long necessary debates. Meantime, the minds of members were changing. Much was to be gained by yielding and accommodating. Had the members committed themselves early and been revealed publicly of their sentiments, they would offer them no opportunity to refine or alter their opinions. So, that was late. It's probably in the same context of what you were referencing, Chris. Late in his life, he reflected back on that secrecy agreement.
Mike.
Yeah, just to put a pin in that, I think students should think about that policymaking requires compromise. And but as citizens, we have to trust that the secrecy is there for compromise and not for corruption, right?
Yep.
So that's where that trust comes in. And there's a lot of legislatures around the world that I would argue are not democracies that use secrecy to hide corrupt deals rather than to hide the compromise. But for the compromise to happen, you really need to have everything that Tim and Chris were just discussing. It's part of, I guess, making the sausage, as we say, right?
Well, I want to be a textualist for a moment. So does this translate this tradition? Does it translate, Chris, into the Constitution? Is there any reference to secrecy in the Constitution?
Well, I think there's a part where in Article 1 in section, that deals with the congressional record, right? And they have the idea of with a concurrence of the both chambers, then they'll release the congressional record, which they will keep that congressional record, which is similar to, actually, in a way, very similar to the record they kept at the convention, because they had kept a record. It wasn't just Madison. There was a record kept at the convention, and they were trying to think about what to do with it. They said, well, you know what? We're going to let the president of the convention decide what to do with this. And Washington decided to hold on to that, I believe, to avoid publication. But I think that's, in terms of like where we're going to publish things, I think that might be the only thing in the text of the document itself about the congressional record, which would take I forget it's a smaller number, I believe, to agree to publish the congressional record. But that, again, is after the fact. It's not ongoing. And that's the only place within the document that I know of that provides for that. And then the other thing too, I would say, let me back up for a second. The speech and debate clause. We see the speech and debate clause to be protected, members in Congress to be protected on the floor. Sorry, Senator Graham. On this speech and debate clause while you're doing business of the Congress. That, I think, is reflective of what we would have seen probably in Parliament, because they were trying to promote this open debate, open discussion. So I think that is in terms of the text of the document itself, David, I think that might be about it. But Tim, you want to So
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, they various states publish their proceedings regularly, most not on a predictable pattern of their of when things were published. So there, it's kind of a hit and miss. There's no hard and fast tendency for the publication of their proceedings.
Yeah, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 there, Chris, just for one of the rare moments in our entire conversation where I get to be really specific there. So we're going to move on to the most scintillating part of our discussion, and that is the rule book of the Philadelphia Convention here. And my understanding, Professor Moore, is that they're like our 5 general categories of rules. They're speaking rules, quorum, stuff like that, how each state can vote. Each state gets to make their own rules, if I'm understanding correctly, on what a quorum is, and things. So to what extent, Tim, were the rules decided upon in Philadelphia an extension of the rules for the Confederation Congress?
Well, I think in large part they're a continuation of how things were done. I mean, the debate about voting in block versus voting by individual delegates, that's a carryover from the articles. They had to pool their votes. I was struck by I glanced over them again this morning. There's like several in there that are specific. Like there's this one rule where you're speaking, you have to address the president, Washington. No one can walk between you while you're speaking to Washington. I
saw that one.
No one can walk in between. You all have to. One of the rules is you had to rise when the president of the convention was leaving. Another rule was I was struck by how influential the role of Washington in some of these rules. When the president comes in and sits down, everybody must now go to your seats. None of this lollygagging around. So I was struck by the influence of his stature influencing. I think it was like 4 or 5 of these. What I call a cat. If you want to make these categories, which I like that. I'd make these the Washington rules. But it was really kind of, I mean, we look at that and we think like, what the heck is that? But I think it goes to his stature, and maybe that dovetails to what Chris was saying earlier.
How about to his ego?
Well, he was prone to that at times, but yeah, the quorum carryover.
He will not speak evil of the indispensable one.
Well, he has war. I mean, what do you want me to do? Deconstruct him, and
you are at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so
well, it's a sport to deconstruct all the founders at Madison, but
right.
But I would say, yeah, it's largely many of the rules procedurally are carryover from other legislatures and the Congress.
Well, I am curious because in my prep and reading, it fascinated me that we kind of come down, to 2 categories. We all like categories of secrecy. And one is the secrecy, which I think we've been focusing on, the secrecy necessary for deliberative democracy and legislative secrecy. That is certain actions of committees and things like that are just necessary there. But then there's administrative secrecy, which is a whole other category we'll get to. But do you accept that those are legitimate categories of secrecy, Tim?
Sure, I do. Yeah.
So the secrecy that they're doing in Philadelphia and then is just tradition and necessities of legislative deliberation.
Yes. Now, Chris referenced this, and he's absolutely right that, in fact, there are newspapers in the middle of the summer that are praising secrecy. In fact, Philadelphia newspapers, where the convention is occurring, Pennsylvania Herald, Pennsylvania Gazette, it's a good omen that they are deliberating in secret. And there's always this argument, don't worry about secrecy because Washington and Franklin are there. So during the summer, newspapermen are quite fine with it. It's only afterwards, to Chris's point, the Sentinel is the best at just the sky. He's Chicken Little with this dark enclave, evil cabal. I mean, just over the top hyperbole on this secrecy. But that's all afterwards, because during it's not much of an issue, if an issue at all.
So have I bought into myth making that there were people trying to find out, break in, look through windows or whatever to find out what was going on?
I think that's the sexy version that I'm not. That's
okay. That's why I asked.
Yeah.
There is this narrative of
there's there's some of it, but it's hardly. I would say it's a glitch, not a trend.
There are some people I know though that are corresponding with people that are at the convention.
Yeah,
they're saying, well, we kind of like the secrecy rule, but I'm really curious.
Gilman, Nicholas Gilman is one. He writes his brother. I think William Blount's another one who writes his brother and says more than he probably should have. Which reminds me, your earlier question, David, about Yates and Lansing, the two. I think you referenced the two New York delegates. They leave, I think, July 10.
Yeah, that's not real quick. I mean, the thing starts in May, so that's a couple months.
Well, they don't like the way things are headed up in terms of a stronger national government. So they don't feel obliged to abide by the secrecy rule because they're no longer at the convention. So they go home, and the first group of people they talk to are George Clinton.
Right.
And inform him what's going on. And they also want to basically hamstring Washington because he can't vote. Because there's not a quorum of New York with two of the three gone. So, but they don't feel they're bound by secrecy because they're not at the convention anymore.
So I want to go into now what I consider the area of fun, which might leave Professor Moore behind because it's maybe a little bit more of presentism here, but we'll encourage him to participate anyway. Professor Williams, the deliberations, mentioned that I read about, like jury duty, congressional committees, I've said, and those are the Supreme Court. They seem to have a practical justification. I am curious, however, and I've played around with this and debated this in my own mind for quite a while, and that is the secrecy of deliberation amongst the Supreme Court. Is that practical and justifiable, that we, the people, don't get to hear our highest court deliberate and discuss the issues and stuff pertaining to cases brought before them?
Yeah, I think there is a justification for it. I mean, you're referring to what we call when the Supreme Court's in conference, right?
Yeah.
So they meet in conference, and one of my colleagues who was on this show a couple of years ago, Del Dixon, I'll show up a book here, has written a book called The Supreme Court in Conference, 1940 to 1985.
Oh my God.
So over 300 cases, he's gone through and he kind of has Tim's job on this, trying to figure out what the justices are writing, their notes during conference. And in this book, you can find notes on Roe v. Wade, you can find notes on Schenck, you can find notes on all those kinds of decisions, right? Dr. Dixon argues that at least in theory, if you ask a justice what the conference is about, it's not about persuading someone, it's about trying to find common ground. It's trying to find out where they are in terms of their understanding of the law. For me, it's the same principle we use for policymaking. I don't know how you could do that and have those notes be revealed in time, or have a camera in the back of the room and be listening to that. I think there has to be some time for deliberation. These are I mean, these are the toughest legal questions in the United States. That's why the court has them. That's why the court has accepted them, right? To hear. But I think the principle, I think, is that I think government officials, the court, can keep secrets, but I don't think in a democracy anything should be secret forever, right? And I've been trying to find, and I'm sorry, students, I forget what the rule is in terms of when these notes are released to the public. There is a rule that dictates that. I can't find it. It's similar to the rule with like presidential records. There's a certain time period that maybe has to go before you can look at them. I think if that rule's in place, where if after 25 years, these notes are public, then you're preserving the idea that the deliberations need to be private to get to the tough decisions. But then you get to know at some point in the future, generations can read about what went into that, and we can make our own judgments about what we think about the justices. So I think there's a reason.
My distinction is certain congressional committees, elective offices, I understand, because if that got, if some, deliberations, information got out, it could affect the outcome. But justices have a lifetime term. So what in the hell are they afraid of people knowing what they said and the intricacies of their legal thought?
Well, I'm not trying to be mean or get technical. We know it's not a lifetime appointment, right? It's appointment in terms of good behavior. So I think, seriously, that's the kind of argument where I guess if you conceptualize the judicial branch as not being political and being immune to any political forces, but I don't see it that way. I see the judicial branch as a political branch. So I would be concerned if those notes got out too soon. There could be political ramifications. I mean, justices might face impeachment, or they might face public scorn, or they might face a lack of trust. So for me, the principle elected versus unelected, it doesn't hold there any more than it holds for me. There are unelected individuals right now in the National Security Administration, right, security agency, who are making incredibly important decisions, of which are secret. And I don't think because they're unelected changes the idea that there are some decisions that need to be hidden from the public, maybe in the short term, in order to make the tough decisions. But I could be wrong on that. Maybe Tim's going to go right after me right now. But
I just was thinking while you were talking, Mike, about administrative agencies. I mean, at least they have public comment. In their processes, they supposedly let the public show up and holler at them for a while about whatever proposals that an agency wants to enact. So, I'm speculating what that would look like for federal justices if there was public comment before they made a decision. But when we talk about unelected, that's what made me think about administrative agencies, whether are they less sheltered from public input because there is public comment?
Well, and as far as the court goes, I don't know that we need to know what they say in conference, because they're it's kind of like a math class. They have to show their work, and they show their work in written opinions. And so we have the written opinion, and if a justice wants to sign on with a majority or the dissent, they can, or they can write a concurrence. They can agree in part. They can disagree in part. So they do have to show their work. But I was kind of laughing inside, Mike, when you talked about rules with the Supreme Court, because I think that the ship has sailed, hasn't it? I mean, the idea that we've had leaked of draft opinions. There's another story about other people playing a role in the court, and I would say that currently the legitimacy of the court as an institution has taken some hits, maybe rightfully so. But I don't mind the conference being in private, because it's much like, I think, the convention. You want people to be able to really truly speak his or her mind, because then eventually there's going to be an opinion, and then you can go after the opinion.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Dave mentioned this at the beginning, how this, or Tim did, we all mentioned it, how this has been something we've been struggling with for a long time, not just us, a lot of democracies. And in my research for getting ready for this week, I learned a couple of things I just didn't know. That the Freedom of Information Act wasn't passed until 1966. At the time, we were only the third nation, democratic nation to pass one. And it was really about, it wasn't like this public movement to get information. It was really the legislative branch wanted information from the executive branch, right? In during the Vietnam stuff. And then the Presidential Records Act wasn't passed until 1978, which declares that presidential records are public and not private. So, I mean, our sort of evolution in terms of thinking about what it means to be secretive in a democracy, it's really started when we became a democracy in 1965, right?
And I'm curious, Mike, just general not, what was the genesis of those two acts? Why did we find the necessity to pass them?
Okay, without being an expert on these acts, I think the Freedom of Information Act comes out of what we've talked about on previous programs, this growing imperial executive branch, and all these decisions making during Vietnam. So the timeline there, I might not be exact there, but I think that's the event. With the Presidential Records Act, I think it goes straight to, I think you can draw a line to Watergate and to Nixon and what Nixon was planning to do or not do with his records.
Which goes back to the original question, I think, about the relationship between secrecy and democracy. And the minute that you justify secrecy in a democratic type system, you open yourself to abuse, which is why I'm far less reticent, or far more reticent, I guess, to accept secrecy, like with the court. Like I said, I still don't know what the consequences are. I understand elected officials trying to be protected because there's relatively immediate consequence. With the court, who cares? And again, to Chris's point, we've now seen in the last few years on the court the corrupt element of that institution. And I'd like it to be far more open, at least televise their proceedings. And I'd like to televise their conference things, just because, secrecy invites corruption and abuse of power. That's my view, especially with the court. Like I said, they have, on good behavior or whatever you want to call it. Name one justice who's been removed for bad behavior.
Well, how many? So
that's because they've all behaved stellarly.
Okay, Hugo.
Fair enough. What are? I mean, I know there are some, so I'm asking for trouble here. But has there been this like avalanche of corruption in the Supreme Court, of Supreme Court justices like getting paid? Like, what are the empirical examples where, because they're secret, there's been corrupt decisions?
Well, we're now just, I think America is now just seen inside based upon good reporting. It's quite possible, based on what Chris just said, that yes, there is undue influence. And maybe that comes out in conference. Maybe an opposing jurist says something snarky like, yeah, I saw you at dinner with that lobbyist the other night. Maybe that comes out, and that becomes a matter of public record that we, the people, then get to discern.
But we have it in their notes. I mean, justices.
But you just said, when are the notes released?
But then, I mean, do you really think if that's going to happen, do you think that it's going to be written down during conference?
Right.
Yeah. They have a recorder in there, don't they?
No, it's all
the rookie on the court takes
yeah,
notes.
there'll be less notes. There'll be less notes taken.
But they take their own notes as well. I think to alleviate and as to not go down this rabbit hole, it would be nice if we actually took the Supreme Court and actually held them to the same standards we hold other members of the bar to, because there are codes of ethics that apply to other members of the judiciary. It's just the Supreme Court, we rely on them and their own ethics.
Virtue.
Yeah, virtue is a word, or a lack of virtue, so maybe, to hold themselves accountable. And unfortunately, I'm going back to our boy Brutus. and they are a little bit of independent of heaven itself when it comes to that, because there's no code of conduct. There's no people over them saying, hey, by the way, you should recuse yourself on this case.
I completely agree with that. I'm just wondering, have there been cases where justices should have recused themselves that we just don't know about? Or is it that we hear about that and the public really just doesn't care? Like, you know what I mean? What's the more likely scenario? Is it?
Well, I think the public in a way does care, depending on which issue we're talking about. Clearly, and I'll be honest, I care that Justice Thomas is on the bench hearing cases that his wife is directly involved in, right? The idea of hearing cases that dealing with the January 6th insurrection, trying to overturn the election of the United States, and yet he has not recused himself, knowing full well that his wife has been involved in this. As a taxpayer and a voter, I'm very concerned about that. But there's nobody there saying, hey, Justice Thomas, maybe you want to sit this one out.
Yeah.
We don't have that.
Well, and Chris, thank you for trying, to recommend that we don't go down this rabbit hole. And I think we got about half of our body down the hole. And so we're gonna move on here. One of the definitive moments in my own life in this subject actually was when I was young, and early 70s, and I remember my mother when the New York Times and Washington Post came out with the Pentagon Papers, and my mom was very politically astute and very politically aware and involved, and the Pentagon Papers case was one of the most significant cases, in my opinion, in American constitutional history. And it deals with the notion of secrecy. And my conclusion from that is that the court seemed to question, all right, the necessity of secrecy in government. Do you agree with me on the Pentagon, as far as the Pentagon Papers case goes, Chris? And I know it deals with more administrative secrecy than deliberative secrecy, although I think because it involved Congress and the presidency, it crosses over those branches. But do you agree with me that the court was very skeptical about secrecy in that case?
I think absolutely. You can go back to Blackstone, you can go back to Madison, because really a big part of this case is the issue of prior restraint. And when the federal court, and not the Supreme Court, issues an injunction against the New York Times, I think that's the first time in over 200 years that the court has okayed the issue of prior restraint, and that injunction stayed in place until Daniel Ellsberg he gets a little mad, or I'll use the good word apoplectic, that the Times stops publishing after a few days. And so he starts sending copies to the Washington Post. Eventually he sends copies to the Boston paper and other papers because of this injunction. And you have different rulings by lower courts. The injunction against the Times was left in place. A lower court said, hey, Washington Post, go ahead and publish. And of course, the debate, the Post is getting pressure from the DOJ. They're getting pressure from the Attorney General. You could be publishing national secrets. You could be held in violation of the Espionage Act back to 1917. Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post, says, go ahead and publish anyway. So the court, this case itself is fascinating because the court agrees to hear this on an expedited fashion. They agree on a Friday. They hear it on a Saturday, and 5 days later, they issue a per curiam opinion for the court. But you have multiple opinions working here in this case. It was a 6-3 ruling. Per curiam for the court means for the court students. It means that's the way the court used to operate. They would just say, okay, we agree, we disagree, boom, that's it. So they issued a very short thing that said, that it can be published, but so many of these justices wrote their own opinions. It's kind of fascinating when you look at the breakdown in terms of who wrote what. So when the students, if you dive into the Pentagon papers, you'll find multiple opinions. But David, back to your point, is the court wasn't buying it. I mean, there's some great language coming out from different justices about this, but the court was not buying this whole idea of national security. Even the first judge, the federal judge to hear this case in New York, who, by the way, was appointed by Nixon, and who this was the first case he had ever heard. He heard it in the same courthouse that the Abrams case was heard. So and even he says, this is it's really important to have he used the word cantankerous press to hold the government accountable. So there's some great language coming out of this from the lower courts all the way through the upper courts. But yeah, David, you're right. The Supreme Court's like, we're not buying this argument of national security.
So, Professor Moore, another area of what I call administrative secrecy is executive privilege, which to me clearly implies secrecy as well as just information being held from the American people. I'm curious about this notion of executive privilege. Was it in the minds of the framers when they designed the executive? Was it in the minds of the first Congress that they would accept that? Is it historical going back to English history? This issue of executive privilege just really bothers me. And we're obviously facing a contemporary case of a former president arguing a very broad stroke of executive privilege, which again, do you agree with me that executive privilege implies secrecy?
Somewhat.
I'm never going to get the man to agree with me 100% on anything, kind of thing. But go ahead there, Professor.
Well, it's interesting to me that it comes up within Washington. I mean, the Congress is the House wants to access to the papers that were all the discussions about the Jay Treaty. And Washington basically says, nope, not going to. Well, he initially says to the Senate, no, I'm not going to give you the papers. And then there's some pushback in the Senate. And then the House wants him to be involved in it. And there's this whole fight about how, the first fight is, do I have to give anybody in Congress, Senate or House? And then the next fight between Washington and Congress was the House wanted him. So it comes up very, very early in our nation's history as to how far this the president's internal discussions about, in this case, foreign policy, would be revealed. Now, eventually, Washington dug his heels in on and did not turn them over to the House, even though they claimed that because they fund treaties, the funding comes through the House, not the Senate. So we have a right to see this stuff. But he dug his heels in on that. Jefferson had a similar thing with Burr. Congress wanted to see the correspondence that Jefferson had with Burr, because this is all related to Burr's treason trial. And Jefferson, he digs his heels in, and eventually partially complies with congressional requests to see his correspondence related to Burr's activities. So was it in the mind of the founders? I think so. But my view is always, how does it work out in real time with specific scenarios? So for me, to see how the first couple instances of this claim of executive privilege are more telling to see what the reality is rather than what they talked about at Philadelphia or may have thought about.
In a practical, and I know looking backwards, so here's my question, Tim, is what's the problem? Jay Treaty has already been agreed to, right?
No, the Senate has to approve it.
So what's the problem of Washington sharing the information?
Because it was a really crappy treaty.
Well, I understand. So is that the motive? They're trying to
protect. It's political cover. It's a crappy treaty, and Washington doesn't even to release all of the papers. in the process of negotiating a crappy treaty is going to reveal more crappiness. So there's definitely a political motive to keep the negotiations of what would become a bad treaty politically from being out there and circulating amongst the public.
Chris or Mike, please help me out here, because we're going to protect bad government because of some. Go ahead, Chris.
I got it. I'm squirming thinking.
Oh, good. I like to make you squirm, bud.
I knew you would on this one, Chris.
Because I'm with you, David, on so many things. But if I'm a guy that's appointed as an advisor to the president, and the president's asking me for my opinion, honest opinion, and I want to be able to give the president my honest opinion, I don't want to have to look over my shoulder to think this is going to become part of the headline in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Bismarck Tribune. So I do think that there's an area for executive privilege here in terms of being able to get advice from the people you appoint as your advisors without them having to divulge what happens there. Because I don't think it's really, in a way, it's much different than what happens in the court in conference, because they're going to argue, they're going to cuss and discuss. You've got to get some justices to sign on. So if I'm sitting in the Oval and I'm telling the president, hey, this idea is just, this is a non-starter. This is, I want to be able to give him honest assessment and honest feedback. And I don't want, if I say something derogatory towards somebody, if I say something perhaps that in this day and age, if I say something that's controversial, I want to think that that's going to be protected. So part of me is like, yeah, there should be, with the president, there should be some stuff that, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I feel dirty saying that.
No. Here's my problem. And again, I think we all concur that there's this, what I would call a limited area, zone of privacy, if we want to call it that, all right, in which their government should not be asked. And most of it is in national security. If we're going to, if we've planned the attack on Osama bin Laden's house, no, that shouldn't be revealed until later. But even to today, it's still classified. We can't find out details now on that. And there might be some rational reasons for this. But one of the few things, and I've mentioned before, my father and I had a contentious relationship. But one of the things that I took very literally and seriously from him is that if you can't say it to somebody's face, then don't say it. All right. And so if I have an idea, all right, about policy or whatever, but I'm afraid of people not liking me or people being angry at me because of that, that's justification for secrecy? Really?
Yes.
What's the big deal? I don't understand the big deal that people don't disagree with me because, and again, why should I be saying something bad about Chris Kavanaugh in a policy meeting inside the Oval Office or the EPA or whatever? Because
we've all hung out in teachers. I mean, think about it this way. Think about hanging out in the teacher's lounge at lunchtime with your buddies in your department and the stuff that is said there, right? And you could be talking about your administration. You could be talking about other students you share. And we say things that, that should not leave the teacher's lounge.
You say things. You know what, Chris, I'm really proud of my career is that I never behind closed doors said something that I wasn't willing to say to the person's face.
Well, more power to you then.
Well, I don't understand why the world doesn't work that way.
Well,
it's not a justification for secrecy.
How many times have you run for public office, David? So that might factor into it as
well.
Well,
I'm smart enough not to run for public office if that's the standard. If that's the standard that I can't be completely open about what I think and feel, then that's fine. Mike, you're looking eager.
No, well, I think I'm leaning towards you on this one, Dave. I think that here's what I came up with in doing research for this. If there is information that is going to reasonably get somebody physically hurt, right? If we can't release the Osama bin Laden stuff because there's still people in the field who, when, if their identities are revealed, then that needs to be kept quiet until they're out of the field and they're not going to be, or whatever. But embarrassment, I guess I'm agreeing with you. Embarrassment, bad political judgment, saying something you wish other people didn't hear. I don't think that's a principled reason to keep things private. I guess for me, though, the timeline would be, and this is getting maybe away from the Jay Treaty, maybe that privilege or that secrecy goes, if we're going to allow it because we want honest talk and compromise to get things done, at the point that thing is done, that bill is voted on and it's either passed or not passed, I think those conversations should then be revealed, as long as no one's going to get physically hurt.
So Mike, based on that logic, then we should put a camera in the conference room for the Supreme Court.
No. I mean, I wouldn't live stream it, but if you're gonna show it after the fact, I guess I'm there. Yeah. And it's gonna have, I mean, look, it's gonna have knock-on consequences, right? About what we think of those individuals making those decisions. And we would have to wrestle with that means. Maybe someone said something because they were just having a real bad day. And that statement doesn't reveal who they are, but it gets out in the public square and they're gonna have to deal with that. I think that's the cost of being a public figure. At the same time, I mean, I guess if we're true to our word, then we would start recording our pre-discussion things and letting
if we get an overwhelming response one day and says, please share your pre-recording, I'm fine with that. If they want to know the real me, because I'm not worried about somebody traveling to my hometown to smack me across the face because of something I said.
I mean this in all sincerity, I'm not being a jerk right here. That's wonderful. I mean, that's wonderful that you're that true and authentic. I got to tell you, if we're recording stuff before we come live and we're going to show it to students, there's a lot of things I'm not going to say, knowing that it's going to be recorded and going to students. I mean,
I guess because, but see, I think that follows the principle of national security. We've got educational procedures to deal with if we want students and teachers to watch this, which to me are reasonable and rational there. Whereas I said, there's this corridor of national security and deliberative democracy, which I will accept as far as secrecy goes. But then, the bulk of it, I mean, we look at, an executive privilege, and we look at, what's the term I'm looking for? Oh, classified information. There have been eight special committees, I guess you call them, or wait, I wrote this down. Blue ribbon, I love that term. Blue ribbon, all right, committees formed since World War II to investigate, the implementation of classified information. And every one of them says we overclassify. We classify information that doesn't need to be classified. I mean, nobody, debates 9/11. Certain elements of that, but certain elements of 9/11 also meant that the torture policies of the United States government, all right, after 9/11 was classified, all right, which made it very difficult for other agencies to, look out. And remember, how was that revealed? That was revealed by, by what method? How did we find out about the torture by the United States government, of individuals, enemy combatants? How was that done? Do you guys remember? Chris?
Whistleblowers.
Whistleblowers.
We have whistleblowers, and this is why we have laws that have come in place to protect whistleblowers, and sometimes they've done a good job and sometimes they haven't. And I agree with your point about overclassification. Even Erwin Griswold, who was a Solicitor General for the United States government in the Pentagon Papers case, he said later that he thought the court decided rightly because we overclassify everything, right? And that's one of the reasons why the Pentagon Papers were classified, because that was the standard operating procedure at the time. we classify too much. But we found out about the torture or enhanced interrogation, depending on which way you fall on that, through whistleblowers and other people. And because they're, I mean, let's face it, we call some of these places dark sites. We took enemy combatants to dark sites and places in Europe and other places around the world to keep the sunlight off of them.
So I guess I would rather err on the side of more openness than less. I mean, just some examples. Michael Hayden, who was once the director of the CIA, he received a Merry Christmas email, and it was classified top secret by the NSA. I mean, that's the overclassification there. Descriptions of Dagestani weddings. Dagestani, I had to look this up. Does anybody know about Dagestan?
No.
It's a region of Russia, and it was a State Department memo on how they hold weddings in that region, and it was classified as top secret. Really? Now, I mean, that's the silly stuff.
David, I agree that we overclassify too much, but if I'm the president of the United States and you guys are my advisors, I want you to be able to come in and talk to me openly, honestly, and not have to worry about over your shoulder, because then I'm going to take the heat for whatever policy I'm going to come up with based upon the advice that I'm going to get from you guys. And I'm not going to throw you guys under the bus, because I want that to be open, right?
Okay.
So I do think there's a place for the president in the Oval or with his advisors to be able to get that information without having to worry about this, to giving up that information. Much like the court is going to write an opinion. Now we know how the court stands. Which I will never happen, but if I'm the president, I'm going to go forward and push a policy based on the advice that I've gotten from my advisors, but I'm not going to throw my advisors under the bus and say, well, that Tim Moore, what an idiot. He gave me this advice.
You'd probably be right.
And so you're okay with that. And again, remember, Chris, I've been consistent. There's a corridor. What you just talked about fits into that corridor.
I struggle with that because I go back to what Mike said from the jump, which is about balance. And the idea that we put the fox in charge of the hen house is a little disconcerting to me, right? That's why I said I was squirming thinking this, but I do think there's a niche there for that concept of executive privilege. But Mike was wanting to jump in.
Well, I just wanted to, I'm not sure if we're going to get to this, but it seems like the Zubaydah case from 2021 is something the students should look at on this, right? That there is a state's secret doctrine, right? And in that Supreme Court case, the government basically the government argued, we shouldn't have to show you, even the court, what, like, the information that we think is so secret, it shouldn't be at the trial. And the Supreme Court decided, you don't even have to show it. It's kind of like the government's word. If the government says it's that important, they don't even have to show it in that limited setting because they're worried it was going to get out. So, I mean, for those who believe that there is too much secrecy, that case is an example of the court sort of justifying the government's ability to keep things secret, even within the judicial branch.
And I'll reiterate my point, Chris, is that we have to choose as a society, all right, which side we're going to err on. And again, I agree with you that corridor, but that corridor also allows advisors to come in to the Oval Office and say, all right, this is how we hide the crimes and previous lies we told about a war in Southeast Asia.
Yep.
And if it weren't for the Pentagon Papers, we would have never known about those. And again, he faced criminal prosecution for that.
Well, it's interesting about the Pentagon Papers because both Nixon and Ellsberg both said they're inconsequential in terms of changing things.
I'm not talking about changing policy. That's a whole separate thing. But the fact of knowing that the American people did not know what was being carried out in their name.
Right. Well,
and that's what bothers me. So
a lot of people did, and a lot of the stuff in the Pentagon Papers was actually public record at the time. Which goes back to, David, your point of the overclassification, which again, so much of that did not need to be classified. So the anti-war folks in the 60s that had been railing against the war, so much of this was just in a way was just kind of vindication for them once this becomes published. So yeah, this is overclassification, but the Pentagon Papers did show how far the government was willing to go to try and keep the secrets and avoid embarrassment.
And I don't know if if I'm willing in this day and age to pay that price. So let's do this. Each of you, I need you to give me your line. Mike's balancing act from the very beginning. Where do you draw the line in deliberative and administrative secrecy? How would you advise kids to address that? Where would you draw the line, Mike?
I would love to share, but I just can't.
There's the line.
There's the line. Okay.
No, I think I'm already.
Well played, sir. Well played.
Trust me.
I think I'm kind of already articulated it. I really do think that there is a distinction between secrecy that's keeping someone from being harmed and secrecy that's about decision making for policy. If you could draw those two lines, and I think secrecy in terms of keeping someone safe, that secrecy needs to be held as long as that person is still in harm's way. I think policy making, I think the secrets should be kept up until the policies have been decided, and then you reveal it. I'm forgetting the exact scenario, but remember when Chris and Tim, you're gonna remember this, I'm gonna be embarrassed. Remember President Bush was debating his energy policy, and he had all the executives from the fossil fuels industry.
Well, that was actually Vice President. That was actually Vice President Cheney.
Yeah.
Thank you. And there was this whole thing about wanting to hide after the fact who was there.
Right.
Well, I guess my balance would be, as those discussions are happening, maybe you keep not the identity of the people who were there, but I think you keep those discussions, what was said there, that maybe that's secret. But once the decision's made, we're either gonna be in favor of this bill or not in favor of this bill. Once that issue has gone away, then I think it should all be open to the public. And if someone's embarrassed, someone's embarrassed. So I guess that's where I would draw the lines.
Chris?
I think it depends on the circumstance. I'm going to be wishy-washy here. Or, sorry, squishy. I'll be squishy here. I think it depends on the issue. Certainly national security. But then again, we know, I mean, we're all historians enough to know that so much has been hidden under that massive umbrella of national security, back to the Pentagon Papers even, or back to, David, as you alluded to, the torture of enemy combatants. So I'm going to go Potter Stewart. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I don't have that's a great question, David. And I don't have a good, chiseled in stone answer for that. So,
but that's a great answer for kids. If they see a guy who's about ready to collect Social Security have that conundrum, then they're probably pretty safe and having their own, questions in their head. Professor Moore?
I'm going to go, first of all, I don't know. I'm going to go with Mike's balancing. I do think, though, I wonder, Mike, if everything is known, like when the law is passed or the policy is enacted, then everything's released. I just wonder whether I can foresee some instances where foreign nations, other nations would know, oh, so player A, advisor to the president, could be vulnerable or bribable, or so I think the exposure, even on domestic policies, I think it might be too simplistic to say, well, foreign policy, maybe there's a tighter rein on releasing information, but I don't know. Again, I'd go back to Chris's statement. It kind of depends, but I can see some domestic policies and advisors being vulnerable to foreign influence if all of that was known immediately and once the policy's enacted. So I guess I tend to avoid rigid statements and policies to begin with. So I'm going to go with balancing, but it's a case by case. Some are balls and some are strikes. They ain't nothing till we call them. So I don't know, David. I don't know.
Sometimes it's sides and sometimes it's not. That's what you should, right?
Well, teachers and students, I'm going to say that when my colleagues have presented, I think, the playing field of the dilemma that you face in this issue. But if I'm going to err, I'm always going to err on the side of openness. That's just my recommendation, and my thoughts on that there. So for the final time in the fall of 2022, we'd like to get some recommendations and insights from our We the People experts here on how to approach this question. I at first, when I saw this question, I wasn't too pleased, but after this session, I'm liking this question more and more. Or after I was, forced, to forced is of course in quotations. I was forced to look into this question. I'm more and more fascinated by it. So we'll go in reverse order there. Professor Williams, insights, recommendations to kids and teachers who are dealing with this question?
Yeah, I actually think our conversation gave a pretty good sort of roadmap of maybe how a good hearing statement could be constructed. I mean, the question is going to require you to talk about Philadelphia, but I think that if I were a judge on this question, I would immediately be thinking, okay, Philadelphia is fine. What about Snowden? And what about state secrets? And what about, right? So I think being able to apply this tension between secrecy and the right versus the right to know and what that means for democracy, have some examples ready. Like maybe each student have a couple examples ready, contemporary examples that you can fire in on. But I think the conversation actually gave a pretty good roadmap of how to deal with it.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, that's honestly, that's what I was going to say, that our discussion is, I would have in your panel before you go to your first hearing, have the same discussion that we just had about why it's important, or why it's, sunshine is the best antiseptic. The whole idea of that whole, I know Tim is a big fan of spectrums here, or continuums, right? So think about where you guys are on that continuum and where it should be. Because if we think that the conference room in the Supreme Court should be open, does that mean jury rooms should be open? Should juries be, that's a whole other issue, because these are common citizens that have been called to jury duty. So think about what we've just discussed and disagreed about, and understand that there's good luck trying to find that hard and fast rule. And I'm not a big fan of this first bullet where it asks students to evaluate the rules. I'm not that verb does not do a lot for me in terms of the question. But I think the rest of the question, in terms of how much of our government should be able to operate in secret, when and why, I think that's a fascinating question. And there are lots of examples to illustrate times should be kept secret, and times when it should be open to the public. And we see it ongoing right now in our daily lives. So what Mike said, pay attention to our discussion, and it's okay to disagree.
Well, let's be very clear. Professor Moore likes categories and spectrums that don't involve data, because that would put him in the arena of political science there. So categories and spectrums are fine. Professor Moore?
Thank you. I think I look at this question as a question about deliberation. How did Philadelphia decide? What rules did they decide that would enhance a full-blown discussion? Now, I like the first bullet, evaluate those, because some of them are so antiquated and it strikes some almost silly. I mean, there were reasons they believed that these would facilitate discussion. So what I would recommend you do, that, you know, one person on your panel know a heck of a lot about how the Senate rules supposedly enhance deliberation. How does the House enhance deliberation? How do administrative agencies, how does the court, and we've done some of that to Mike and Chris's point, but the question is really, in my mind, about what do we do to enhance discussions, enhance deliberations. So go around the branches and see and look at current policies. And, you know, and maybe you'll see that there's some similarities to the Philadelphia rules. But so I'd say it's essentially a question, a thought exercise in deliberation.
So I'm not going to get into my colleagues have done an outstanding job, as they always do from week to week, on insights and recommendations. This is our last session, and so most of you who are watching are getting ready for some event competition in your communities, in your states and stuff. And so I would just remind you that this program, which I've been involved with since 1987 and its inception, is not about being right. Every week that we do this show, I'm pretty sure that I'm not right about a lot of things, but it doesn't stop me from making an argument. And that's what I would suggest to all of you students and teachers to recommend to your students: make an argument and try to make sure that your argument is fairly well planted in philosophy or history or legalism or whatever. Just make an argument. And as a group, we, and all of us here have judged at all levels of the competition, regional, state, national. And the most fascinating teams are those in which we see a diversity of opinions and insights coming, and where they're making arguments, and they're arguing against each other in a respectable way. And just remember in this journey of yours that from one of my not favorite bands, but one of my favorite songs, you will never pass this way again. So what do you care? You're never going to see these judges and most of your classmates. You're never going to see them again. So what do you care what they think? So say what you feel and what you think during your testimonies. So we have come to the end of our fall segment of the Constitution of American Life. And we've enjoyed it. I'll be honest, it's been a wonderful season. We enjoy each other, and the only reason we do this is that we love each other enough to want to spend one day a week and some hours not only talking to each other, but talking about the material that we love. I will tell you that at this point in my life, you never can predict the future, and you don't know what's going to happen. But as of right now, we plan on being back in January and dealing with the national questions, and we hope that that comes to fruition. Until then, good luck to all of you as you go into your events. Those of you who are just casual observers and like the Constitution, good luck to you in the coming administration and session of Congress. Until we see you next time, peace, love, Yogurt Tacos, bye-bye, bye bonds.